Good morning. Can you hear me? Yes? Good. So, as has been indicated, I have to speak in English. If you want to, you can pose your question in Portuguese, but there's no guarantee that I understand. Maybe anywhere between 50 and 70% of what you'll ask I understand, and if I don't get what you mean, I'll ask the others. And if you can ask your question in English, of course, this would be nice. The topic of my talk is inequality, and this is based on a collaborative research project where we study inequality empirically on all continents, but not in all countries. The structure of my talk will be that I first introduce the general framework, the background of this project, what we're doing and how we're doing it. Then I'll say something about the concepts, not about the entire theory, but just introduce some main concepts. After this, I'll briefly outline our methodology, and then I present results. And I think I'll make a short break after point 3 or beginning of point 4, so we can have a first round of discussion and also questions concerning theory and methodology. So point number 1, what's the framework, the organization of our research? We have teams, for example, in Brazil, but also in Germany, in India, Italy, Laos, Thailand, South Africa, and we have small teams consisting of 1 to 5 people in a lot of other countries as well. And these teams work in cooperation with each other. There's communication between the teams, but no team has to follow the lead of the other. So nobody says what the other have to do, or nobody sort of forces any other team to use particular methods or instruments or even interpret the results in a certain way. And people come and go, so to speak. There is a solid network of maybe 70 people or so who have been engaged in this research for many years, but some people only join for a year or 3 years or so, and then they do something else. And people also join who have a research project like many of you, where inequality plays a role, but it's not the key topic. So they engage in the discussions and they learn, and then they do their own thing. So we have research groups as well, for example, on transnational elites or on gender, and they work with us and they produce papers and ideas, but they are not necessarily members of the research group studying inequality in these particular countries. We started this research actually as a debate. So I myself started studying philosophy, and I did this in many cities in Europe. And at some point I did my studies with Bourdieu for a while, and then I figured sociology is more interesting than philosophy, so I switched to sociology. But I still did my PhD in philosophy, and then I continued in sociology, but today I'm in area studies. Why? Because I mainly study in the global south, and as you may be aware of, in the global north, that is, for example, in Germany, if you study a southern country, you're not a sociologist. Why? Because this doesn't exist. There's only anthropology that studies non-Western, or let's say non-Northern societies, and if you're a sociologist, you study either North America or Western Europe. So my studies are more widely read in fields like area studies, like anthropology, even law, but not so much in sociology, because the German sociologists don't care about anything outside of Germany, maybe including France, Great Britain, US, but that's it. So I did much of my early research in Southeast Asia, and that's where I started studying inequality more than 20 years ago. And then at some point, when I was still at the University of Freiburg in southern Germany, this was maybe 2007 or so, I invited a guy called Jesse Souza, and he presented his theory of inequality in the global south. And I had to say, okay, what you are presenting here may be true for Latin America, but exactly nothing is true for Asia, what you say. So then we had a huge debate, and afterwards we decided we have to compare Latin America with Southeast Asia. And this is what we did until maybe 2012 or so. And then we started applying our insights to Germany. So the methods, the ideas, the theory, and also the results that we had gained before from this comparison, we applied to Germany, and we had to revise some things, but the core of the, approach came from the global south, and when that was then applied to the global north. And then we went out to study other countries again. So we completed the study of Germany in 2015, and ever since we've studied other countries. I will present you some of the results. Right now we are working in the US and India mainly, but we are trying to carry out this global comparison that I will be presenting you results of. This is like the framework of the research, and our main hypothesis, which is based on the research we have carried out so far, is that all capitalist societies develop a particular structure of social classes, so a hierarchy of social classes, and we suppose this is the case because the mechanisms of inequality are very similar in all capitalist societies, and because all societies are integrated into the capitalist world system, and all societies adopt a similar type of capitalism around the world. However, the class structure differs from country to country, even though they are all social classes, and it's all a hierarchy of classes, and it's all capitalist societies. The particular structure, how many classes, how to define the classes, what the limits between the classes are, depends on the previous history of the nation state. And in many states, pre-capitalist structures persist up to the present day, and all the classes are informed by the pre-capitalist structures. I will illustrate this with regard to several countries, including Brazil, in the second part of my presentation. So we have two dimensions. On the one hand, the dimension of classes, and on the other hand, the pre-capitalist inequalities, which partly persist and partly shape the classes of contemporary society. If we look at the global level, we can see that the class structures are similar, and that also means the relative positions of all of us on a global level are similar. You can experience this with migration. When you migrate as an academic, which many of us actually do, it doesn't really matter in which society we actually migrate to. Our social position will be very similar to our position in the country of origin. And the same is true if you migrate as a poor peasant or as a non-skilled laborer from one country to the other. You will still end up very near the bottom of society. However, if you migrate from the global north to the south, your chances are better than the other way around. And that means your position also depends not only on the class position, but also on the position of the nation state in the global hierarchy. And of course, the global hierarchy is pretty clear. I don't have to say much about this. So let's get to the concepts that we use. I just introduced this, say, new concept of ours, social culture, and I'm sorry that I have to introduce a new concept, but there is nothing so far that captures what we're saying here, so I have to introduce this concept. It's as it's written here, an earlier social structure, in our case a pre-capitalist social structure, which persists in present-day society and also shapes the configuration of inequality in contemporary society. And if we look at capitalist societies, their social structures or hierarchies of classes are always a transformation of earlier structures. So we can understand what we see today as a transformation of earlier structures. And many of these structures persist. To give you an example, from Europe, in most European countries, the law is organized very much like a guild. So you have a professional organization which either lets you in or doesn't let you in. And if you're not a member of this association and you don't make it into the association, you don't get a license to practice law. This is not a market. We're supposed to live in market societies, but this is the exact opposite of a market. And it is rooted in the Middle Ages when we had guilds. So the guild structure still persists, not only in the profession of law, but also profession of medicine, profession of chimney sweepers and others in Europe. And of course, if we look at Brazil, I will get back to this, a structure that still informs contemporary Brazilian society is colonialism and slavery. So we don't understand Brazilian society if we don't take this into consideration. Of course, Brazil doesn't have slavery anymore, and of course, Brazil is not a colonial society anymore, but much of contemporary inequality can be explained against the background of colonialism and slavery. I'll get back to this later. And the same is true for all societies around the world. And in some societies, the capitalist transformation took place only recently. So the pre-capitalist structures are still very visible, and they are also very potent and much more explanatory than, say, the capitalist structure. I will explain this later on with regard to India. But it's very obvious if you look around the world, especially in Southeast Asia, but also Africa. You have independence movements in the 1960s only, and independence sometimes only 1970, 1980. And then some of these governments tried to establish a socialist form of government and society. And capitalism was only introduced very recently. If the colonial period was very long, the colonialists, of course, already implemented some aspects of capitalism, but capitalism as we know it was implemented only recently, and that means the class structure only was established in the past decades, and that means it's still very fragile. And often it is relevant only for a small part of the population. This is what we mean when we talk about social culture, and we argue that the focus on socio-economic inequality or the focus on capitalist structures does not let us understand contemporary society. We need the dimension of social culture as well. If we now turn towards the capitalist social culture, which means the hierarchy of social classes, I also have to sort of try to avoid some misunderstandings and introduce a component into the concept which may not be completely familiar to you. We have to distinguish social class from the two prevailing approaches to the notion of class. The first one is professional class. This is like the dominant model of approaching class around the world in inequality studies, especially associated with the name of John Goldthorpe. There you have social structure comprising, depending on the year and the particular society, 9 to 11 professional classes. The problem with this is, first of all, not all people have a profession. Secondly, in the non-capitalist setting, profession plays a very subordinate role and often no role at all. A peasant, a rice-growing peasant in Asia, what is his or her profession? It's a meaningless question. And then thirdly, the very top of the society often don't have professions either. They live off capital. If you like, rent seeking is their main profession, and often only one member in the family takes care of the money and the others do nothing, or actually they do things that are fun, but they don't have a profession in the strong sense. And then fourthly, and this is the most important point, profession is only one aspect of the social person we are. And if we judge our social position on the basis of profession, we are often misled, because many of us will have this profession at some point in our life and another profession at another point. And we may have, say, a high position in a certain period and a lower position in another period. And usually what happens, of course, is that we either rise in rank with age or we get unemployed at some point. But it's not likely that we remain on the same level for our entire life. So to take the profession is misleading, and I tell you in a minute why, from our perspective, it is even completely false to focus on it. The second way of looking at inequality is the one we see in the newspapers and often in World Bank publications and so on. This is the focus on economic factors, usually income, sometimes wealth. Income is misleading because, same argument as before, rice-growing peasant does not have an income necessarily. It's even more misleading if we look at the upper class, same as before, because they live off their capital, and the income itself is not all that relevant. And then we have to consider the same thing as I said before. Some of us will have a certain income at some point in our lives and another income at another point. So which income do we choose? And usually the surveys in inequality studies don't even look at the entire life course. They look at one point in time. And what happens is that most of you will end up in the lowest class because you're students and you don't have a substantial income. So Yeah. And of course, this doesn't make much sense. Wealth is better indicator, but it also has some of the problems I have just addressed. If you look at wealth only, at money only, you can also be misled. So if we look at the upper class, in almost every family we have at least one dropout. So a person who becomes a revolutionary, or who becomes an artist, or who just travels around the world or whatever, and doesn't seem to have access to the money of the family. So this person would be poor, but he or she would still belong to the upper class. And the same would be true for many of us. So many of us would not necessarily have a high amount of wealth if we compare ourselves as academics with, say, entrepreneurs, or, in our case, maybe judges or so, who make more money than academics and are able to save, and usually have parents who also already have a substantial amount of money and they inherit this. Does that mean these two groups differ very much in social class? No, it doesn't. So if we look at wealth, it's a bit better than income, but it still isolates one factor, and this factor is not precise in establishing class position. So wealth and income and profession important, but only aspects of the social person. So we look at several aspects of the social person, and we try to identify all the aspects that are relevant in order to access socially valued goods, functions, positions, activities, and also to be valued in society. Symbolically valued. I'll get back to this phrase later as well. And if we look at it at the combination of these socially important factors, we can see that a social class reproduces itself from one generation to the next, and that many elements that are relevant for defining social class are also passed on from one generation to the next. Like wealth, like profession, but also education and, say, basic attitudes, basic forms of behavior, and what we call habitus traits. That means aspects, patterns of behavior that are deeply seated and that are usually acquired early on in childhood. One example would be, we were just talking about this yesterday with regard to Brazil. One example would be self-confidence, because we found this is a marker of upper class social position in Brazil, but we find this all over the world. All the upper classes have a high amount of self-confidence and the lower classes don't. It's almost like a social class marker. But this is just one example, one habitus trait, and this is something that you acquire early on in childhood. And this is something also you cannot easily, or possibly not at all, acquire later. You have to grow up with the feeling of being special, of being chosen, of having the right to everything, of owning the world, and of just going there and behaving as you like and not caring about what the others think of you, because they are not worth as much as you are anyway. And this is a habitus trait that you acquire in a social certain environment, and you don't acquire it in the middle classes or the lower classes. Just to give you one example, and we identify several traits like these in our interviews that we conduct, and these traits often differ from society to society, but one trait or characteristic that seems to be common to all the upper classes is self-confidence. Just to give you this example. The term habitus, of course, we take from Bourdieu, and Bourdieu never really defined what habitus is to him. Everything's habitus, all our forms of behavior are habitus, and he says, okay, if you do this, if you, for example, use this type of computer, you belong to this social class. Oh no, you're from another social class, so it's not habitus. So this is his strategy of explanation, and of course it's not an explanation. He just claims 3/4 of our actions are determined by habitus and 1/4 is not. So everything that doesn't work as an explanation is just displaced to the 1/4 that doesn't explain behavior. We try to be more precise in our approach, and we say habitus is only those patterns of behavior that are socially relevant, or rather that are socially distinctive. So if it distinguishes one social group, not necessarily only class, but one social group from another, then it can be subsumed under habitus. And we focus on what we call primary habitus, that is those patterns that are acquired early in childhood, or more precisely, that are deep-seated and that you cannot change easily over time. So, for example, the way you walk or the way you sort of sit or so can be interpreted as socially distinctive, but you can also interpret it as just something that you do. And if it's just something that you do, it's irrelevant to us, but if it is significant for your social position and for distinguishing you from other social positions, then we take it into account. And if we look at the combination of all of these factors, we can see what I just said before, that they are passed on from one generation to the next. They do change over time, and you do not share all your, say, important habitus traits with your parents, but you share many. You share many, and those you do not share are still rooted in what you learned from your parents or the persons you grew up with, who sort of educated you, maybe grandparents or whoever. Anyway, these people pass on these characteristics like self-confidence from them to you. And they also pass on, as I mentioned, something like wealth. So most people who are wealthy in the world, or almost all of them, inherited their money. Even Donald Trump, he claims to be a self-made man. Now look at it more precisely. His father made all the money, and Donald Trump lost most of it. This is how self-made he is. And if you look at most, say, very wealthy people in the world, it's like this. And even if you look at somebody like Bill Gates, who supposedly was a poor guy working in his garage, his parents were upper middle class. Okay, they were not upper class, but is Bill Gates upper class? Not yet sure. It's something we can discuss later, but I would have doubts to already place Bill Gates in the upper class. So he's, of course, 1,000 times richer than his parents, but he might still be in the same class, still have the same class position, because all the other characteristics he has, starting with self-confidence, through things like flexibility, autonomy, political convictions, and so on, he would share with his parents. And he would also share his level of education with his parents. So we have to look at all these factors in order to determine social class, and we can see the social class is very similar to something like a tribe or so that has a common culture, common values, common forms of behavior, common forms of recognizing each other and including people and excluding people. And this is reproduced from one generation to the next. And like in a tribe, all of these things constantly change. So environment changes, activities change, belief change, clothes change, and so on. But they're still rooted in the same tradition, and they form a tradition that develops over time. So we speak of a class as a tradition line. It's a tradition line. This is the thing that differs between social class and a tribe. It's a line because it's hierarchical, and a tribe does not necessarily have a hierarchical position. So class is a tradition line that has a certain position within a social hierarchy. And this position is reproduced not only through passing on capital and habitus to the next generation, but also through distinction. So who is part of us and who is not. And this we call symbolic classification. If you have your first job interview, you will feel this really like physically. The person who assesses you as a member of a social class or even as a subculture or group, but especially in terms of social class. And he or she will immediately sense, do you belong to us or do you belong to the group that has to be hired or not? And you can do whatever you like. You will sort of sooner or later betray your intentions and show who you really are. My example always is when you have the job interview and your nose is running, what do you do? What do you do? Which kind of handkerchief do you take? How do you blow your nose in front of the person? Do you turn away? Do you have a cloth handkerchief? And so on and so on. You can learn these things, but you cannot learn all of them. So we talked about the diplomatic exam. This is exactly where these things play out. If you don't have what it takes, you fail. But how do you get what it takes? You get it in your life course, and you usually get it from your parents. And if you don't get those basic traits from your parents, there's almost no way you can sort of develop a personality that fits into the tradition line or the social class. And the social class sort of actively reproduces this by excluding people who do not belong into this class. And of course, in Brazil, it's very easy. You go to a social environment where you don't belong to, and people will show you quite clearly that you don't belong there. It's the same everywhere. It's very pronounced in Brazil, but it's the same everywhere. And it's something that is very close to racism. We also call it symbolic racism. You're assessed on the basis of some kind of, say, characteristics you have. And on this basis, you're included or excluded, and you're valued or, say, undervalued or devalued even, or even dehumanized. And of course, all the women in the room know this too, because it's also the same as sexism, the same thing. You're judged on the basis of one characteristic you have, and you're valued less only because of this characteristic. And the same is true for social inequality. Some characteristics are identified, and on this basis you belong to the social class or you don't. And you can change this, but it's very unlikely. And this is something we found in our research on capitalist inequality. That means social class, not the other social cultures, but social class. It's almost impossible to cross the boundaries between social classes. There's a lot of mobility within class, and often the social classes are really large, and you have people at the bottom, so to speak, who make, say, 1,000 reais a month, and others at the top who make 20,000 reais, and this is a huge difference. But if you look at it more closely, they share more than they do not share. And the critical thing is to cross the dividing line to the next class, up and downwards. So in many capitalist societies we have studied, we find mobility rates between classes no more than 3%. For example, in our sample of Germany, we have 350 qualitative interviews with all sections of the society, so from homeless people to a couple of billionaires who also come from aristocratic families, so a large sample. And in this sample we have no single case of definite social mobility. We have some cases where it's possible that these people did actually cross class lines, but it's also very likely that they didn't, that they only have a certain characteristic for a certain period of time that makes them very close to the next class, but doesn't necessarily mean that they crossed the boundaries, like Bill Gates. We don't know whether Bill Gates is already in the American upper class. We have to wait what happens with his children, and we have to wait what happens with him, until he dies. And we have to wait whether he gets access to the inner circles of the upper class, to the clubs, if he's invited by people, if his children marry somebody from the upper class, and so on and so on. And if all this happens, then we can say, yes, he did cross the boundaries between upper middle class and upper class. And as I said, there are very, very few examples. And if we look at one aspect only, and if we look at one individual only, and if we look at one point in time only, we don't get the picture. And this is important for our research. We have to look at the combination of characteristics, and we have to follow the itinerary of people over at least 3 generations. We have single individuals who may or may not drop out of the class. But if we look at the entire family, and if we look at their children and their parents, all of them still belong to the same class. And then we cannot speak of mobility if one person makes it or fails for a certain period of time. A very good example around the world is football players. A lot of football players are pretty rich. If you look at them 10 years, 20 years after they finish their careers, what are they? They're usually poor. They usually end up where they come from. So in Germany, for example, we have the managers of German football. Those of you who are interested in this, Beckenbauer and Bierhoff and Hoeneß, these are famous people, and they are rich, and you could consider them upper middle class. But now, did they make it? No, they didn't. Why? Because you look at their parents. Bierhoff's father was even CEO of one of the largest German companies, so you could say if Bierhoff had mobility, it was downward and not upward. But still, it's upper middle class. So he was CEO of Bayer, which is BASF, one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. his father. So if Bierhoff is CEO of German Football Association, yeah, okay. And Hoeneß's father was a businessman, and so was Beckenbauer's. So these people just reproduce the class position. Now look at other football players. Many of them, or probably most of them, come from lower middle class or even lower class. Look at them, what happens to them 20 years after they finish their career. They will be exactly in the same position again. And the 2 or 3 football players around the world who do not sort of drop back into their original position, you have to check their children and grandchildren as well, and their wives and their wider family and so on. And then often you will see that they remain in the same kind of social surrounding or in the same tradition line, which means in the same social class. And therefore, we always trace the family tradition over several generations. We ask about grandparents, about parents, about children, and if possible, siblings like sisters and brothers and so on. And if they're very old, about children and grandchildren and so on. And then we make something like family trees, and we can see how the position and the characteristics are reproduced, even if the family changes, say, the profession, the place of living, the surroundings, the language, and so on. We can see how the social position is relatively reproduced. And we have to include all the aspects of capital and habitus in this. As I said, if we look only at money, we are misled. If we look only at education, we're misled. If we look at one habitus type characteristic or 2 or 3, we are misled. But what never happens is really that all of these characteristics completely change. So most of the characteristics will be the same, but we don't know which ones. So you share, just to give you an example, the level of self-confidence with your parents. You share the level of autonomy, that is the idea of being master of your own life, with your parents. You share the profession with your parents, maybe even the income, but you don't share, say, the level of education. But your brother or sister, he has the same level of education as your parents, but he does not have, say, the same level of income. And then you have a grandchild or something, and he or she will share other characteristics with your parents and others not. So this we call family resemblance. This is a term by the philosopher Wittgenstein, and he argued that in logic we should not look for subsumption, that is for identity between factors, but it more works like in a family resemblances. And this actually means something like exactly the same as a family. Next time you have a family reunion, you check this. You will see that all of you have a characteristic nose, say, and a characteristic forehead, and a characteristic, say, hair growth or something. But then you look at the individuals and you will see some do not have the same nose, but they may have the same hair. Then you have some who do have a different hair, but they may have the same nose. Some have neither the same hair nor the same nose, but then they have the same forehead, and so on. So you all share things in your family, but no 2 individuals are identical. They differ, but they share certain things. And this Wittgenstein calls family resemblance, and we use this term family resemblance in order to study social class. So we say something like, in order to operationalize the whole thing, And also, in order to be able to make statistical calculations, we fix something like 8 out of 12 characteristics or 9 out of 12 have to be given in order to assign a particular individual to a particular social class. Of course, it would be better to have a more, more appropriate statistical instrument which can actually portray the family resemblance. And we have colleagues actually in the Faculty of Law, but they are statisticians and they are working on a method to actually convey this. But so far we use multiple correspondence analysis. I'll explain to you in a minute how this works. This is an instrument that was also used by Bourdieu. In order to carry out the multiple correspondence analysis, we can collect data, and the main form of data that we collect is a life course interview. So we ask people basically 5 questions. Tell us something about your family background, about your childhood, about your education, about your profession or what you're doing, and about your ideas of your own future. So what will happen to you in the next 10 years or so. And then we ask some additional questions which are country specific. So for example, in India we would ask about caste. This question doesn't make much sense in Brazil. In Brazil we would ask about skin color. This question is not really relevant in Germany, for example. And so on and so on. So a list of maybe 20 additional questions, also about attitudes, and then another list of about 10 questions which are the social data, so age, gender, income, and so on. But the main thing is the life course interview, and this interview is interpreted after transcription by a group. Those postdocs of you who will be here on Thursday, I'll explain to you in more detail how this works, or in a lot of detail how this works, but this would lead too far in this context now. So we interpret these interviews as a group, not an individual, but a group, and we discuss it line by line. And this is quite lengthy. Sometimes you need an entire day or more to discuss an interview, but it's very revealing because you have different perspectives on the same thing. And that means in the group you need people who come from different backgrounds. And we almost always have a multicultural team, so some people are familiar with the local context, others are not. We have different ages, genders, and about social position it's more difficult because all academics usually come from the middle classes and often even upper middle class, so it's difficult to get people from upper and lower classes into the team. But still, the social heterogeneity is very important, and it sort of makes us retrieve the richness of the interviews. And we try to identify the characteristics that are relevant for this particular person in his or her life course. And then we try to identify what level of say this particular characteristic this person has. And of course we identify in a capitalist context things like wealth also as important. But it can also be other things like caste in India or so, or skin color in South Africa, that are irrelevant in other societies. In general, in the capitalist context, we find these to be important: profession, income, wealth. Of course, as we know, education usually is clear too. What is very relevant is the partner you choose. You think it's a romantic choice and you choose him or her out of love. But who do you fall in love with? You will see this is very rarely a person with a very different social background, and often the person would be from the same social class as well. So in Germany we found that about 60% come from the same class, definitely from the same class, and 80% rather similar social position, and the others would often be multicultural partnerships and so on. And what we also found to be extremely important is the style of education. And by this we mean the relationship between the parenting persons and the person, him or herself, which means, is it supportive? Do you get something like extracurricular activities? Does your mom drive you to soccer in the evening and to violin class in the afternoon and so on? Or does your father hit you every day when he comes home? This makes a radical difference for your life course. Of course, these are two extremes, but there are other forms like neglect, so parents don't really care, or they don't have any time, or they have a rather neutral, standardized relationship to you, and so on. And of course, this is important for the level of self-confidence you reach, for the trust you have in society and yourself, and so on. Then the school type, this is pretty clear, I guess. The friends you have, from which social class do they come, from which social context also. Then membership, this is maybe not so evident. We find that in the capitalist context, all the upper class people are member of an important organization. So ask yourself, are you a member of an organization? And I can tell you which class you come from, basically. So, of course, in the lower classes, people also sometimes are members of an organization, and this would, in America, that means North and South, often be a church. But this is quite different from an influential organization. So, for example, in Germany, all the upper class people are members of some kind of a business association or a business related association. And in other societies it's different, and the relevance of this factor also differs, but it's an upper class market to a certain degree. And the same would be true for the next one. Do you have any honorary titles, or were you honored by society in some way? Okay, it's evident that only certain classes have access to this as well. And the habitus traits, they differ more between societies, of course, because the habitus is rooted in the tradition line, and the tradition line in turn is rooted in pre-capitalist structures, which differ from one society to the next. So in the Americas, we find the degree and the type of individualism very important. So all the Americans, North and South, are individualists, but the way they are individualists, this differs between not necessarily classes, but within classes. So you have people who are more rooted in something like collective understanding of individualism, if you can say so, which means they believe the individual is at least partly determined by the social environment and by the society. And you have people who completely believe in the liberal dream that everybody makes him or herself. And this is true for Brazil and for US, and it seems Mexico as well. And it's not so true for the other parts of the world. So if you apply this characteristic to India, it doesn't work, because nobody thinks in such terms, for example. So habitus traits are more diverse, but I mentioned one, self-confidence, which seems to work in all the capitalist societies. We then, after interpreting the interviews and identifying the important factors, sort of assess the value of each factor for each individual case. So how self-confident is this person? And of course, this now looks very precise because it's mathematical, but actually this is the most imprecise step of the entire procedure. How do you say this person is a 3 and this person is a 4? This is a bit random, but it's not entirely random because 3 and 4 is different from 0 and 6, say. So there is a certain, say, weakness in the procedure here, but we try to compensate for this weakness by having each interview interpreted first by the group and then by many individuals from different contexts, and only if they deviate by only one step or so, we take the material. Otherwise, we either reinterpret the interview or we drop it. So people have to agree to a certain or to a large degree about the interpretation of this number. And then we carry out a multiple correspondence analysis, which correlates each factor with each other factor. And therefore, it's pretty close to our intention of displaying family resemblances. So how does self-confidence relate to income, to wealth, to level of education, to, say, something like autonomy, even to age and gender and so on? And we do this with every factor, or actually the software does it with every factor. And then we get something like a cluster analysis where characteristics that are likely to appear in a particular person or a particular class are displayed close to each other, and those who are likely to not appear in the same person are very far from each other. I will show you several multiple correspondence analyses a bit later, and then it becomes clear how it works. And on the basis of these clusters, we make hypotheses about classes, and then we try to link these classes to research about social cultures, that means previous or pre-capitalist structures. In some cases, this research is entirely historical because the capitalist transformation is so far back. In Brazil, it's quite far in the past, but still the remnants, as I said, of earlier social cultures are there. In Germany, it's very far past, or in Great Britain, you could say at least 200 years or so, maybe 400 years was the capitalist transformation. But in most societies that we study, it was still within the lifetime of older people. So we can still use the interviews to gain information about the earlier social cultures. To give you an example, in Laos, where I did a lot of my studies, colonialism ended in 1975, but actually the French colonialists didn't really have much of an impact on the society because they just conquered the area and then they felt it was too expensive to do something about it, to exploit it. No access to the sea, very mountainous territory, so let's just leave it as it is. And a lot of people did not even know that they lived in a French colony. And even later, people did not know that they had a king or what the name of the king was and so on. And even I myself, in 2003, when I did field work near the Vietnamese border, the Minister of Education asked me to check whether there were people. So the government did not even know if there were people in a certain region of its own territory 15 years ago. This indicates to you that these people did not were not really integrated into the state structure, and that they were left rather untouched also by colonialism. And that also means the habitus is very much informed by structures that are neither colonial nor socialist nor capitalist. And you can still meet people and talk to people who grew up like this. And then 1975, socialist revolution, and along with China and Vietnam, late 80s, early 90s, capitalist transformation. All happened within the lifespan of people who you can still talk to. And that means the interviews give you information about the social cultures as well. And you have to combine this with historical research. We'll have a short break for discussion, I think, in a minute. But before this, I would just show you the example of Germany, so it's not so abstract, so you get a first idea of how what I was saying in very abstract terms is applied to the concrete cases. So if we look at one factor only, we can see a certain reproduction of the social position. This is cultural capital as measured as the level of education. And we can see here, if the father had basic school education, which means in the German case, the absolute minimum, the legal minimum of formal education, then about 57% of the children also have this level of education. But this is only the father. So often, as would be the case in Brazil too, the daughter would more follow the model of the mother. And often the mother would have a lower level of education, formal education, than the father in the older generations. So the correlation, if we take the parents together, is much stronger in reality. But if we look only at the father and the kid, then we see that in principle about half of the people have the same level of education as their parents. And this is a very strong reproduction, not only because of the gender factor, but also because of age. In Germany, we had what we call the education revolution in the 1970s, when a lot of people entered university and got higher degrees, secondary and tertiary degrees, which their parents did not have. So they differ, and they are included in this table. But the entire society rose in the level of education. It's not one class, but the entire society. So the children were not necessarily better off in economic terms, and they did not necessarily change their class position. They only had a higher level of education. So if we look only at education, we see a strong correlation, 50% identical, but we miss all these other factors. So we miss the change in society at large, we miss the gender factor, we miss factors that are associated with other forms of cultural capital, and so on. To give you one example, next example is if we look at profession, and here we make it even more pinpointed and say more tiny in terms of correlation. We look only at the grandfather, and only at the paternal grandfather, so the father of the father, and the person, him or herself. And this means some of these people, these grandfathers, would be born in the 19th century. And of course, in the 19th century, parts of Germany were still quite rural. So you still had peasants, and you still had a real working class just emerging, and so on and so on. But still, in spite of this, there is a certain reproduction of profession, even though things like IT did not exist 20 years ago. A working class did not really exist 120 years ago. Something like highly educated professionals hardly existed 100 years ago, and the entire society was still in Germany very much like a feudal society. And in spite of all of this, you have a certain reproduction of the professional, say, foundations in the family. And as you can see, the reproduction is highest within within unskilled labor, but also at the top, highly educated professionals tend to reproduce their profession. We are actually quite surprised how many of us have the same profession as their parents. We talked about this, Ottavio and I, yesterday. He seems to be trying to reproduce his father's profession. And he tried not to before, and the same with me. I tried to do other things, but my father's a university professor, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. But I tried. I became a translator first, and actually I went into business first, and then I became a translator and an author, but finally here I am. So I'm surprised how many of us actually experience this type of destiny, we could even call it. And of course, the profession is not just professor, but if I had become, say, a lawyer or a doctor or so, it would still be the same professional group. Okay, but these are only two factors, level of education and profession, and there are strong correlations. If we take all of these factors together, then the correlation is much stronger, because we can say, okay, level of education is different, but all the other factors are similar or the same as the parents. Or profession is different, but the other factors are the same. And that means, to give you an example, if you're born the child of an unskilled laborer, it's possible to get education. It may be possible even to get education and another job, or a real job, skilled labor. But it's basically impossible to get a PhD, to become a lawyer, to marry somebody from the upper middle class, to develop self-confidence, and so on and so on. This doesn't exist socially. There are some cases where people acquire some characteristics, and as I said, there may be cases of social mobility where many of the characteristics are socially improved, or they're changed so that they're valued, but the entire combination of characteristics is never changed within the lifetime of an individual. So, if we look at the combination of factors, for example, through multiple correspondence analysis, we get typologies which characterize class. And you cannot read this, and even if you could, you cannot, because it's in German. Don't worry, all the other slides are in English, but the problem is the software produces this, and I get a PDF, so I can't really change the language, and these are the characteristics that we applied in our German study. And basically what appears here is a diagonal picture, so you have the lowest class in the lower left-hand corner and the upper class in the upper right-hand corner. And you have a variation of characteristics within each class, which is typical also around the world, but they become, say, less chaotic at the ends of the society. So, for example, we ask about wealth, and we ask, do you have possessions that are worth more than 500,000 euros, so 2 million reais? in 3 dimensions. Shares, then say money or liquid assets, in real estate, and in something like tangibles. So, I don't know, like important works of arts that are expensive and so on. And only in the upper class we find that people have possession of this value in all 3 dimensions. In 1 dimension, yes, possibly below also, but not in all 3 dimensions. And people who have this are likely to also have a certain level of income, a high level of income, and they are likely to have a habitus type that we call autonomous and ambitious, which means a habitus type which is focused on accomplishment. So manager type, if you like, CEO type. If we now look at the opposite end, Arbeitssuchend means looking for work, or unemployed. This is the politically correct word for unemployed in German. And these people, of course, they make little money. And it doesn't make sense to ask them for their wealth because they don't have any. And what is interesting, they all state that they're not satisfied with their life. And these characteristics, these 3 characteristics, are very likely to appear in a person together. So if one appears, the 2 others are likely to appear as well. And I sort of alluded to this earlier, and then I let you ask some questions and make suggestions or utter critique. I said this earlier, down here are the students. They are the odd man out. Why? Because they don't have any money. And this is the same all around the world in our studies. The students are a group apart. They have a very high level of education and usually characteristics that put them into the upper classes, maybe middle class, but usually more upper middle class, or possibly even upper class. But they don't share the economic characteristics with these classes. So, do you have questions?
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. I enjoyed it very much. I read your text you sent us before, and I have 2 questions, if you could please answer. I think it's more methodological questions, but I would like to hear from you. You said at the beginning of your lecture that you have teams in different countries, and you don't have a leadership in these teams. So I would like to ask you how you compare the results, how you compare the data you collect to do a global study of inequality. This is the first question. And the second one is, in the text you hand out to us about the South Africa, you said you are using European concepts, sort of, to study these societies. They are not European societies, and has a historical background different. Is it possible to use native concepts to understand the difference of these societies, or you have to use the same concepts used to these European societies to understand? Thank you.
These are excellent questions. Thank you. Very nice. The first question, is actually related to the second in a certain way, but I'll ask it answered separately. So if there is no, say, leadership in the project, how can you compare if each team does its own thing and does not necessarily comply theoretically and empirically with the others? You're right, this is a problem, and sometimes it doesn't work. For example, the Brazilian teams has included now the Goldthorpe professions also in its assessment of the data, and in the other countries we don't do this because we think it's misleading. So the results now from Brazil are a bit different from the other results, and it's difficult to integrate them into the same model. So you're perfectly right, it is a problem. So the only solution is whoever does the comparison has to go back to the data and then throw out the professions and recalculate all of this. So that's what we're doing right now. And right now in Berlin we have a team of 15 people who are engaged in this international comparison from about 8 different countries or 9. Asia, Africa, Latin America, Europe. And there we're engaged in this process. And to sort of move on to your second question, because we are discussing this, this makes it even worse to sort of try to take account of the local variation and at the same time try to come up with a coherent conceptual apparatus, because it is very evident that what we call social ontology differs from one society to the next, and often even within societies. So what a society is very different, to give you an example, in Brazil, to the social classes, but also say for indigenous peoples in the Amazon and business people in Sao Paulo. What is a society? Who is member of the society? How is the social position assessed? What is important? What do you strive for in your life? Why should you have money or so? This differs between societies and often even within society. So this is something we have to take into account as well, to sort of say, okay, you make this amount of money and it's more than the average, so you're upper middle class. This doesn't work, or it works, but it's rather meaningless. So we have to figure out how these societies are actually organized, and this leads us back to the social cultures. In the capitalist dimension, it's very similar everywhere. But in the other dimensions, which also persist and inform the class structure, it's localized and differs. And therefore, for the social cultures, we often use indigenous terms, and the relation between the indigenous terms and the general concepts also differs. I will give you examples later with regard to Asian societies, especially Thailand. I can show you how this works, the relation between indigenous concepts and social cultures and capitalism, and also how this works in reality, not just in theory. So both of these points are really important, and I don't have an absolute solution to neither of these points. So we're dealing with them, and I would suppose that these are actually, both of them are real problems. So the relation between authority and multiplicity in organizational terms, and the relation between general theory and indigenous or local realities. These are real problems, This is nothing you invent or just come up with, and there is no, say, one-fits-all solution, I guess.
Good morning, Professor. I'd like to thank you for the lecture. I'm going to read my question in order to facilitate the application. Just have wrote this kind of position. Norbert Elias has wrote his great book Established Outsiders at 1964 about a small village in England named Winston Park, as everybody probably knows. He analyzed 3 different groups from 3 different locals in this village. And despite their more or less similar social conditions, 2 of these groups considered itself superior than the others, believing strongly that they really were superior human beings in relation related to the others. His main argument about this behavior was not the richness or poorness of this group, neither their professional or economic classes. He had argued that this behavior was related to a social cultural aspect of this population, the habitus, based simply on the time of living on that place. They distinguish, exclude, and discriminate the first. I'm sorry. I'm running. The first appearance of this village distinguish, exclude, and discriminate the latest, the outsiders. Let's say, who just arrived and came of other place. Norbert Elias has made a kind of micro-history. Now my question. Norbert Elias has made a kind of micro-history, starting off a microcosmos in order to understand the largest pattern, from the village to the nation. As I understand about your studies with Jesse and Professor Jota, you have made the opposite, starting from the large spectrum in order to understand the social inequalities in general. My question is, with this approach, don't you think that you may make invisible the individual and the microcosmos, and in so doing, at the end, contributes to reproduce this structure of exclusion itself?
I will answer much more than your question, because the book by Norbert Elias sort of opens up several dimensions that are important for our research and important for understanding what we're actually doing. So the pattern of inclusion and exclusion that Elias shows in this book is very similar to what we argue in terms of social class. So the patterns are really similar, and things like, as I said, racism or sexism also work similarly to Elias's, say, study, almost anthropological study of this place in England. And there I really agree very much with Norbert Elias. The second aspect is that of social class. So yes, there are smaller communities than social class, of course. And our patterns of behavior are not all uniform across social class. And you cannot explain us as individuals only on the level of social class. Of course, but this is not our interest. We want to see how inequality works, and especially how social inequality works within nation states and even or especially on the global level. So all the variations in everyday life and also the differences between subcultural groups are irrelevant to us. We simply don't look at this. And I also think Bourdieu was misguided in his work Distinction to include things like wine consumption and art consumption because it's too individual for his purpose. And if you look at the numbers, the probabilities, they are also very low. He claims or he presents them as if they were very strong arguments, but actually only twice as many people in the upper class prefer red wine to beer than in the lower class. So yeah, I find this sort of misleading and betraying his own purpose in a way. So we're not interested in this. And Elias has these two tendencies. He was also interested in macro structures, and he wrote a book which actually is, if you read it more closely, very nice but also very weak, about the process of civilization. But he also studied more micrological aspects, and in this particular book, I would say the intention is not to reject the notion of social class, but to look at this functioning of exclusion. And as I said, I agree with this. And the third dimension of your question concerns these micro structures, which in a way alludes also to our concept of social cultures. So what we do study is persisting structures like these of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. We did not really study this particularly, but similar structures elsewhere in the world. For example, in India, we're just doing this right now at the moment. We have conducted interviews in about 30, 40, 50 villages which have very different structures. And all these structures persist up to this day, and I will get back to this when I talk about India later, and then you can get a sense. All of these villages are completely different from each other, and they range from extreme patriarchy to matriarchal societies, from one caste villages to extreme oppression related to caste and so on. So it's a huge variation, and this is important for inequality. But who is considered an insider and an outsider in a social group is not necessarily important if, and this is the case as you indicated with Elias's study, if they belong to the same social class. We're not really interested in this aspect. Only in the aspect of social culture, that is, structures of inequality that persist from pre-capitalist times or pre-capitalist structures. And this leads to your final, say, point about us reproducing the structures of inequality through our work. Yes, this is always a danger, that if you point to something in reality that you reproduce it because it becomes then visible, and there are also words for it and so on. But the opposite is true too. If you don't address them, they will persist and they will be reproduced all the more. So, yes.
Thank you very much. I really like this approach and that attempts to make concrete the idea of habitus. But I apologize, I didn't read the text that's found it. But I have some, I will ask you, maybe I didn't understand right. But it sounds to me too determinist, too essentialist. And because I'm working with memory, construction of representation, and I like Bourdieu, but I think it's I think the category of field is important too, because my behavior is different in the field, in the academic field, for example, and different in law field, because I'm a lawyer too. It's different when I am at home with my family, with my middle class family, and when I am so I'm in the words almost impossible, unlikely, and it sounds to me too strong, too determinist. So I will ask you how you can cope with this kind of relativity, changing things, individual and in a group level.
Yeah, actually, I think the opposite is the case. I think it's not deterministic enough because we don't understand it well enough. So it's still somewhat statistical, and there's still space for, say, for chance in this. And I think we're determined much more than we show here. And this is both, say, on a very general level. So according to neurophysiologists, what happens is our body takes a decision, and then we become aware of the decision, and we believe we made it as individuals. This is more, I think, more appropriate to think of an individual. And then think about what is really individual about you or me. What did we create in terms of, say, language, ideas, personality, and so on? And what did we take from society? Not too much remains that is individual in this sense. But this is just on the general level. And on this level of social class, it's even worse. We're determined even more, partly because what I just answered to you before, because we don't even understand and we don't even know how we're determined, and partly because there's no way we can get access to it. What can you do about your childhood? If your childhood was messed up, you can try to forget it, you can try to see a psychologist or whatever, but you cannot redo it. It's just the way it is. And if you're born into a family without any money whatsoever, there's no way. You can win the lottery perhaps, yes, but what happens to people who win the lottery? They lose all the money because they have no idea how to invest it and so on. So I think the determination is much stronger than this indicates. And of course, I'm very familiar with this charge to Bourdieu, he's deterministic and so on. I think this is a misunderstanding of Bourdieu, but partly it's Bourdieu's own fault because he was partly too lazy. As I said, he says habitus determines everything, and if it doesn't, well, okay, then it's something like liberty or individualism. No, you have to explain this part as well. He just didn't do it. Why? Because he looked at this multitude of factors which are not really relevant. And now we come to this field issue. Sure, you behave differently inside this classroom and inside the bar and inside your house, and when being on vacation, you speak differently, you think differently, you're even a different person, yes. But do you have a different class position? No, unlikely. Unlikely, and even the access to these different fields depends on your class position. So I started like my research on inequality 20 years ago in Laos by making exactly your argument, by saying we should drop the idea of social space and fixed class position and dissolve everything into fields and then study the different fields and the position in those. But it turns out that that class, in a way, if we can say something like this, does exist. This is a meaningless statement. I would rather say does matter. And for some types of research, of course, field is more appropriate and more interesting, but for this type of research, for inequality, no. So we don't use the term field at all anymore, and actually none of us does. I'm not aware of anyone except a very few people who do specialized studies of, say, the field of law in Brazil or so. But otherwise, people who study inequality at large, none of us uses the term field anymore.
Good morning, Professor. My name is Natalia. Thank you very much for your lecture. I'm thinking about tools to fight inequality, or, for example, when governments try to income distribution policies or another. And thinking of mobility, I would like to ask you, how do you think it's possible to increase class mobility? Especially because it looks very static from your point of from your research, and I'm curious especially about the thing of self-confidence, because it looks like a very psychological aspect, and how to work with this psychological aspect when you think about governmental policies, or you think about how to cultural change or this kind of thing. Thank you very much.
Yeah, of course, this is a question we discuss a lot as well. And we become, say, more and more pessimistic about this. Also, in connection to my answer to your question. And I think it seems that only one type of event can do something about the reproduction of inequality, and this is a massive break in society. So when we studied Germany, our hypothesis was that all these transformations in the 20th century did lead to some kind of mobility. So we had 2 world wars, we had a revolution in 1919, we had the breakdown of East Germany in 1989, we had a social revolution in 1968, and so on, and we thought all of this would have led to some mobility. No, we didn't find any indications except for the breakdown of fascism. This did lead to some mobility. Why? First, a significant portion of the population was gone, and especially, and which doesn't usually happen, upper and upper middle classes, so a lot of people of Jewish descent were either dead or had emigrated to other places, and many of these people were rather rich and educated and so on. So there would not be American hegemony in the university system if these Germans had not gone to America at the time. So this was really significant for Germany. Then, of course, a lot of, say, officers and so on had died in the war. A lot of white-collar people had died in the war. Then there was the attempt of what we call denazification. So people who were associated with the regime were removed by the Allies from important functions. So a lot of space in the upper ranks of society became vacant, and people from the lower middle class mostly, they moved into these and made their own spaces vacant for people from the lower class. This is really the only window where we see social mobility. But we also seem to see social mobility, and I'll say something about this a bit in a few minutes, in Brazil with the Bolsa Familia and the whole associate system. It seems, this is Jesse's argument, it's more his than mine, but I have to draw on his ideas and material here. It seems that this whole class of what he calls batalhadores emerged through this government intervention. And this is what we see elsewhere too, that government intervention can also have effects. And this was your question. So yes, there can be effects on social inequality, but to really reach something like equality, this of course is very distant, but even to diminish inequality between classes, this is extremely difficult because of the multiplicity of factors and because it's embodied in us, and to get rid of our body is impossible, so it has to be a long-term process, and this long-term process has to be guided and followed up. And there have to be massive social forces who want this and who push this and who have the power to push this. I'm very pessimistic about this, but it's not impossible, as I said, and only massive events, massive interventions do lead to some kind of change or mobility.
Thank you very much for this presentation and for these late things you are saying about history and time. I am very interested in the way, I suppose you will talk about this later, the way you are taking in consideration generations, not only from father to son, but within the same siblings. There are very different kind of trajectories. So at the third or fourth generations, you are seeing, I wonder if you are not seeing a difference between mobility, with mobility. I mean, if you are doing family trees, there is at each generation groups of family that are going down and others that are going on. So I am not so pessimistic about mobility as you are, and it is very important what you are saying about history. The special history of Germany you are saying, but also at level global. For example, Piketty is very pointing to the fact that the big transformation of the principle of 20th century, where the capital was a big factor of wealth and so on, and how after the wars the work factor became the criterion to help mobility. Now, I agree, I think that we are in a historical period where there is no more such mobility. But as Natalie said, we may think that there are possibilities to change another time. So this is the other reason why I'm not so pessimistic.
Yeah, please.
Thank you, Boike. Just to add two things in this
analysis. Once, I think you can talk about process of phenomena, global process like immigration. Do you think immigration can change the mobility? Because today you see a big process of mobility, global mobility. I think this is one possibility. And revolution. When you study inequality, you think, so if you are pessimist, if you can do anything, so when you talk about revolution.
Thank you, Professor. I have two questions, but they are methodological ones. And simple questions. The first one is, how many variables do you have? Because it's impressive research. And you said 3,000 interviews. And you have one day to analyze only one interview. So how do you do that? And how do you weight the variables? Because you have a lot of categories. So how do you weight to show us? I think that's the distribution of your. How do you weight the variables?
Yeah, good. The only problem I have now is how to organize the answers because the questions were very different. But maybe we can start with the change and revolution thing. With Piketty, it's exactly the problem that I alluded to early on in the paper. He looks at wealth. Wealth is one dimension. If you look at one dimension only, you can see mobility and change and stuff. But if you combine wealth with income and education and habitus and cultural capital and symbolic capital and so on, no, very little. And this is the ideological moment of inequality research. They make us believe that everything's random, and today you make 100 reais more, so you made it into the next social class because you have 2.1 salarios minimos instead of 1.9 and so on. Yeah, same thing. So I don't agree with the Piketty approach at all, even though I really like his book and I think it's really important. But if you look at social mobility in this time, no, you have some financial mobility and you have less economic inequality. So workers have more money and more power, and capitalists have less money and less power over a certain period of time. But this is only for political reasons, and now we come back to intervention and revolution and so on. This is only for political reasons, and basically it's due to the Second World War and to Roosevelt's intervention and to the problem, and this is the main thing, the problem of the capitalist world having to defend itself against communism. And once communism disappeared in 1989, inequality rose back to its previous levels. But of course it started rising already under Reagan and Thatcher and this whole neoliberal revolution. Yeah. So revolution, yes, is one of the other things that can change something, but most revolutions have assumed that you can create a new human being, as many communists have put it, overnight. So you create new institutions, a new regime, a new society, and people are different the next day as well. But we argue now it's embodied in the habitus, and it's inequality, and it's even passed on to the next generation. And all the communist leaders in the communist countries of the first and third world, they had to find this out. And most of them wrote sooner or later about it. It's not possible to create a socialist man within our lifetime, so we have to think of new strategies. And this, of course, is a problem. You have to come up with a strategy that looks both at political power and at social structures. So technically you would have to maintain political power until social structures have begun to change. And this means a long period of time, and most people would not be willing to put off the changes to the next generation or to 2-3 generations to come. So it's a really difficult situation. It's much better to say we leave it as it is and we make it a little bit better by giving you a bit more money and taking a bit more money from you. And this is what happens, but there's no change in the class structure on the basis of this type of policies. So yes, long periods of time, and you say change is possible over long periods of time. This type of change you were alluding to is quite fragmented and individualized. Yes, it does happen that in the course of generations, some members of the family dissociate from the original family and enter new social class. In terms of upward mobility, what we see usually around the world with the persisting gender inequality that women marry a man from an upper class. This is the main model of social mobility. But of course, people can also impoverish, or as I said, people go and walk around the world or become an artist or whatever, then impoverish and so on. This type of thing happens. But we have to follow this for several generations because sometimes they come back up again. This also happens. And I acknowledged that this can happen, but I said no more than 3%. So it does happen, but it's not really changing the structure. And it takes a long period of time. And now in our interviews in the United States, we made it a point to really emphasize also the siblings and the rest of the family. And yeah, unfortunately, the picture doesn't change much on this basis. So the idea you have is still an exception rather than the rule. So now I have to jump to methodology. The aspect of interpretation, how we deal with the huge amount of material, would be the same answer. In a way, it's time. We just need a lot of time. It's as simple as that. We have been doing this research individually for like 20 years and as a group for like 12, 13, 14 years. Then you can do a lot of interpretation and things. And it's not a research project. You know, usually research is organized in projects, so you get 3 years maximum. You do this, you write a report, and at best a book, usually a report or a paper, and then you do something else. No, all of us do this research until we die. So we will advance quite a bit further, but how far we advance until when, we don't know. That's it. And how do we weight the variables? This is done by the software, basically. So the dimensions of this, and then basically I can go back to continuing my talk, if you like, and introduce the other countries. The dimensions here, so left to right and top to bottom, are defined by the software. The software calculates which factor determines the others more than the other way around. And then it sort of reduces these cross determinations, which usually are like 20 or so in our case, It can be up to, in some countries, 40 variables. It reduces them to 2 dimensions. One dimension is usually mostly determined by one variable, but often by one variable plus a few others to a certain degree. But this is not clearly visible. So here it's rather clear that something like education, it's a bit like Bourdieu's space in this case, because it's Germany and France. So education is more left to right, but it's not really education only, and it's not even cultural capital only. It's more something like the creative side of society and the conventional disciplined ordinary side of society. So you have all the artists and creative people, of course students as well, the alternative scene and so on the left, on the right hand side, and the more conventional people on the left hand side. In tendency is more like this, and it's associated usually with cultural capital and education, but it's not a one-to-one fit. And bottom to top would be more economic capital, but also in a way more in terms of, in this case, you could say these are variables that show your affinity with the structure. So to which degree are you integrated into the system in terms of habitus, in terms of behavior, in terms of thinking, but also in terms of your function in society. So discipline would be very high up, as well as ambition, as well as money, and so on. It's not, interestingly, the graph is not entirely different from Brazil. At least there are some similarities.
Thank you, Professor, for your conference. I'd like to know something about the methodological question in the research here in Brazil. How the group that did the research here, how they use it. I don't know if this category exists in the research, but the skin color, how they use this information in this framework. Because when we think about the possibility or the impossibility of mobilization in the social class, we can think about 3 or 4 generations, and we can think about a new body in 3 or 4 generations. We can learn in 3 or 4 generations how to talk in another way, how to sit in another way, and other things. But we can't change the skin color. So I'd like to know if this factor, skin color, is understood as a symbolic capital or a cultural capital, or as an habitus, part of an habitus. How this factor of skin color entry in this research? I'd like to know this. Is a methodological question, how they understood the skin color in the framework to understand the mobilization of social class in Brazil. Because I have some doubts if we think the skin color as a factor in all these questions, if we can reach the effects of racism in the mobilization or in the position of social class. I'd like to understand about it.
I'm laughing because I'm very happy about your question. It allows me to sort of motivate you to come back after the break, because Otavio said we should make a short break to have a coffee or something, because I will address this question with regard to the Brazilian case after the break in detail. I will give you an exact answer.